if I can get your attention, we'd like to go ahead and get the program underway tonight. It is a thrill to see so many people here to meet with us and talk a little bit about what's going on in Olympia, what the Freedom Foundation is doing to advance our mission. And for anyone who is not too familiar with the Freedom Foundation and hasn't heard much about us, our mission is to advance individual liberty, free enterprise, and limited accountable government. It's a real simple mission, but a very important one. We do that with 4 key capacities. We research, report, educate, and litigate. We'll talk a little bit more about what we do in each of those areas later on. But before we get started, I wanted to give a huge thank you to the church for hosting us tonight. We're always grateful to have friends in the cities that we visit willing to open up their space for us, so we're incredibly grateful for that. I wanted to ask, I know I saw a couple of Republican Party committee members here. Were there any other elected officials that were able to make it tonight? Yes, ma'am.
I'm a state committee woman from Grant County.
State committee woman from Grant County. And what was your name?
Susan Freeman.
Susan Freeman. Thank you so much for coming. Anybody else? Did anyone run for office? No one ran for office this time around? All right, well, that's one of the things that we're hoping for. We like to focus. What was that?
I voted for myself.
We got someone who voted for himself, so he voted for a Liberty candidate, so that's something.
Spokane State GOP committee woman, Susan Wilmoth right here. The state committee, the state committee man for GOP Spokane County, Mike Cathcart here.
Great, thank you so much for being
And
here.
several board members, by the way.
Tim Chestnut.
Could you raise your hand so we can all see you? Ken Chestnut? Tim Chestnut. Great. Anyone else? And yes, sir.
Bruce Thompson.
Bruce Thompson. Well, thank you all for being here. It's always a pleasure when we know that elected officials are coming out to kind of hear the ideas that we're talking about. Is there any media present by any chance? Every once in a while, media folks come out. We welcome media.
John Charleston.
Yeah, John Charleston's also.
Where's that?
Yeah, this is
There we go. Well, you know, we welcome media at our events because that's how we get the word out. Sure, there are going to be some folks in the media who are going to put their slant on the things that we say, but quite frankly, we're happy when people know what we're talking about. We think that at the events that we host, at the events that we speak at, we're always going to be putting out pro-freedom ideas, and there will be people who will hear those messages, even if they don't already agree with us, and it may open their eyes and bring them closer to our vision of individual liberty and limited government. We can't help but think that that's a good thing. So we welcome that kind of coverage. So our focus tonight, if you don't know, we do the Free Washington Tour twice a year. We try and do it after the regular legislative session ends in the spring, and then we try to go after the elections are held in November. And so this is our second trip this year. And what we wanted to focus on this time around is the influence that special interests have in the political process in Washington. And so we're going to have my colleague, Max Nelsen, talk a little bit about the different types of special interests and some of the things that they have done to try and influence politicians to grant them special favors. And so I think you'll be really interested with the content of Max's message. And then when he's done, I'm going to come back up and I'll talk a little bit about those 4 core capacities that I mentioned that the Freedom Foundation has. And I'll talk about what it means to me to be part of the Freedom Foundation team. Also, if you look in front of you, you'll find, or in the packets that were sitting on your seats, you'll find Connect cards right here. One of the things that's really important for us is to be able to know who's come out to our events. That way we can keep in touch with you. If you call into our offices to talk to us about something, we'll know who we're talking to. We can say, oh yeah, you were at our event in Spokane. Thanks so much for calling. So if you would, please fill out the information there on the card. We'll take these up later on, and we're going to have a couple of drawings. One of those drawings is going to be for a copy of the Washington State Constitution. This is a document that the Freedom Foundation produces as an exclusive. It's got our state constitution. It also has our federal constitution in there. It's a really great resource. So someone's going to win a copy of this. We'll also have additional copies for sale for $5, which is a fantastic deal for a resource like this. We're also going to be giving away a copy of enlightened democracy, the case for the Electoral College. Many of you know that for the last several years, there's been a real push, especially among people on the left, to try and eliminate the Electoral College. What they want is for whoever wins the popular vote in the presidential race to automatically win the election. Our founding fathers were actually really wise in including the Electoral College because it meant that a president would always have to take account for people who live in rural communities, people who live in smaller states. The president couldn't just focus on representing the people in the major urban centers, in the centers of commercial power. The president would always have to take into account people who lived in rural and less populated areas. So it's a very important principle. This book explains a lot of the history and philosophy behind the Electoral College and why it's so important for the Electoral College to continue as part of our political process. So someone's going to win a copy of this book too. But for right now, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Max. He is one of the newest members of our Freedom Foundation team. We're very lucky to have him. He actually recently graduated from Whitworth University right here in Spokane. He got his degree in political science. Then he did some work for WashingtonVotes.org. He also worked for a while with the Washington Policy Center. And then we were lucky to hire him on board as our labor policy analyst. He has proven himself to be incredibly capable, especially for someone so young. His work has been published in the Seattle Times, in the Puget Sound Business Journal, in a national outlet, the American Spectator, and he's also gotten some great exposure in major media outlets like the New York Times, Fox News, the PBS NewsHour, and the Seattle Channel. So again, he's building quite a reputation for himself even at a very young age, and we are incredibly lucky to have him as part of our team. So I hope you will help me in welcoming Max Nelsen.
Well, it is certainly my pleasure to be here with you folks tonight. As you might already have figured out, my voice is kind of shot. Day before the tour started, I woke up sick and doing a lot of talking for the last few days. So please bear with me. I am very happy to be back in town. As Dave mentioned, I graduated not too long ago from Whitworth University up north of here a little ways. My wife and I got married in this town, and so I'm very happy to be passing through again. So as Dave has mentioned, the theme for our Free Washington tour this time around is special interests and their effect on Washington State's political process, our elections, and so forth. And so this is a good time to be talking about this issue. First thing I'd like to start off addressing is the recent special session we had over the weekend. Anybody want to give me a one or two word explanation of what the special session last Saturday was about? Well, I got a couple answers. Boeing, there we go. That was the one I was looking for. Boeing, exactly. So what happened was last week, Governor Inslee called the legislature back into session for ostensibly to pass this big transportation package that he wanted. Part of that would have included a 10-cent increase in the gas tax. Thankfully, right after he came out and made this big announcement, we have to have this transportation package get passed in order to keep Boeing's presence in our state. Boeing and the union that works for Boeing came out and basically said, no, we don't really need this big package in order for Boeing to... thank you. We don't really need this big package to keep Boeing in Washington. We really just want to make sure that Boeing is going to keep getting the tax break that it's been getting and some other fairly non-controversial measures. So thankfully, when the legislature was in session, they were only in session for a day. They only passed some fairly straightforward bills extending tax credits for Boeing and did not try to tackle a big transportation reform package. But that will be a subject that is likely to come up in the next regular session. And there's even talk of calling another special session, as crazy as that may sound, the fourth one this year. So we'll see if that actually happens or not. A couple of interesting things to take away from the special session, though. Folks on the more leftward side of the aisle were getting up and talking about the wonderful merits and benefits of tax breaks for companies, for businesses. Something that you don't usually see happening in Olympia a lot, at least from some of these legislators. We've got some interesting footage that we're putting together and kind of a debrief from the special session. If you guys make sure to put down your email address on those Connect cards, we'll try to make sure we get that information out to you about the special session soon, because there's some fun video footage there. But the main point to take away is this really was a special interest special session. It was only called for the sole purpose of keeping Boeing's production of their new 770X aircraft in Everett, in Washington State. And to do that, they were passing these tax breaks specifically for Boeing. So there were some state legislators, thankfully, who got up and made the argument, hey, if big Boeing, if big corporate Boeing needs these tax breaks in order to stay competitive in a global environment, why can't we extend these tax breaks to all businesses in Washington State? What about the small businesses? Don't they have an even harder time competing in a global economic environment? Well, of course they do. So our position at the Freedom Foundation and the position of at least some of these folks who made this argument in the legislature is that tax breaks for businesses are fine, but tax breaks for select businesses, that's another story. These are our laws and our tax policies should be applying to all businesses equally, not picking out ones for special favors. So now that we've kind of got a handle on the legislative session, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what I've been working on for the last 6 months or so, which is labor unions in particular, reforming labor law in Washington State. And so I would argue that labor unions in Washington, particularly public sector government employees labor unions, are one of the big, most influential special interests out there in Washington elections. Now it's important to distinguish something. Participation in the political process is great by businesses, by individuals, even by unions. There's nothing inherently wrong with a union participating in the political process. But when an interest, when a faction, as James Madison would call it, starts trying to manipulate government, manipulate the levers of government for their own benefit at the expense of the public welfare, that's when things start to be a problem. And so, again, public employees unions in particular have gotten into this self-sustaining cycle, which works for their benefit but doesn't work so much for the benefit of the state of Washington as a whole. And so there's two important things you need to understand about Washington state law and labor unions. The first is what's called exclusive representation. And basically what this means is that when a union is certified in a workplace as the bargaining representative of employees, it is the only representative of any employees in that business. So no other union can represent, another section of workers in the business. An individual worker can't opt out of the union. Everybody in that business, in that bargaining unit, is represented by that one. Excuse me. by that one union. And so essentially what you see is a monopoly on workplace representation. And just like any other monopoly, unions are able to charge more for workplace representation than it actually costs them to provide for workers. And so the excess funds, again, particularly in the case of public unions, the excess funds can be used to lobby the legislature or influence election outcomes. All of those pieces work together to expand the size of government, to expand the size of government budgets, to increase public workforce, because this results in more dues-paying membership for public employees unions, which can then take that money and funnel it back into influencing the political system for its own ends. And so you have this self-sustaining cycle that has been created. Now, when I first came to the Freedom Foundation, everybody had kind of a general, a vague notion that we know unions are big players in the political scene in Washington, but nobody really knows exactly how significant their influence really is. And so one of the first things that I did was sit down and go through several months worth of Public Disclosure Commission records from elections in Washington State last year. And so if you guys would pull out the green folder, the undue influence folder, this is the result of our study here on the elections from last year. And so if you'd open it up and turn to the left page, there's a chart A, and you'll see a picture of Rob McKenna and Jay Hensley. And I'd like to highlight just a couple of our findings. First of all, no, it's okay. I tried cough drops a few hours ago. It didn't help too much. First thing I'd like to highlight is that 46%, exit polling indicated that about 46% of voters in union households in Washington voted to support Rob McKenna for governor. But if you look over at how the union leadership in Washington allocated the money in the governor's race, well over 99% of union funds went to support Jay Inslee. So there's a very strong disconnect between the political priorities of union membership in Washington and the political priorities of union leadership, which distributes the funds they are able to forcibly collect from union members. So overall, we found that union funds contributed just over a quarter of Jay Inslee's total support in that race. So when you factor in all the money that was spent to elect Jay Inslee, about a quarter of it can be traced back to unions. We also looked at 31 state legislative races, and that's chart B in that middle section there. And on average, state senators and state representatives on the Democratic side of the aisle received about a third of their support ultimately from unions. And in certain races, in key races, that level was as high as 75%. And so there are literally cases where the candidate would not have had a credible campaign, would not have had any campaign at all without the influence of union funds. And in at least multiple cases, it's very safe to say that the influence and the presence of union funds changed the outcome of these races. And the same could be said for the elections that we've had just recently, last week. How many of you folks were familiar with the 26th District legislative race? Yes, some of you folks. Between Jan Angel, Republican, and Nathan Schlicker, Democrat. It was probably the most important electoral race in the state this year. Ultimately, Jan Angel, the Republican, was able to win and kind of pad the Senate Majority Coalition's margins there a little bit, which was a great move. We're very happy to see that happened. But labor unions made it a priority, a very big priority, to support her opponent, Nathan Schlicker. And again, when we analyzed the numbers in that race, about a third of his funds came from union sources. And that works out to about just under $500,000. Very significant amount of funding. And it's also worth noting that the funds that we've reported in Nathan Schlicker's race and in the races here are actually on the low end. There's for instance, a legal loophole which allows union members or union leaders to communicate with their membership about how to vote. We can send out a mailing to all of our members telling them to vote for Jay Inslee. But that doesn't have to be reported as a political expense. That's considered internal membership communication within the union. And so that does not show up in any of the numbers that we've reported. Just a fun fact. The other race that I would like to draw your attention to is in the airport city over on the west side, SeaTac, Washington. I see a couple of you folks nodding your heads. What happened over the summer, labor unions were able to get enough signatures collected in the city of SeaTac to get this ballot initiative in the election last week. And what the initiative would do if it passes, they're still counting votes, among other things, it would create a $15 minimum wage for certain employers, would require mandatory paid sick leave, make it harder to hire part-time workers. Just a few of the examples. There are many more. It's a very complicated piece of law. But the kicker, the really interesting part of the initiative is that it creates two sets of rules for union and non-union employers. So for instance, there's a clause at the end of the initiative which says that union businesses can waive any of the other requirements in the law in their contract negotiations. And so what it does is it creates an incentive for folks who are, their business is trying to cope with this $15 minimum wage requirement and the other requirements, gives them an incentive to consider allowing their workforce to unionize or encouraging their workforce to unionize in the hope that they can negotiate away some of those more arduous requirements. This is a new tactic that labor unions have used successfully in some other cities, but this is the first time that we've seen it in the Pacific Northwest. And so regardless of the end outcome in CTAC, expect to see similar initiatives like this either on the west side, maybe on the east side, who knows. But it's a very stark example of what labor can do when they have their heart set on something. Unions provided about $1.2 million to pass this initiative in CTAC, and there's only about 12,000 registered voters in the city. So that's about $111 per registered voter. That was over 94% of the total funds raised to pass the initiative came from labor unions. Very, very significant race. The last races that I'd like to mention, you folks I'm sure are already very familiar with. Just in case you were tempted to think that this labor thing, this union thing, is only a West Side issue or only a statewide issue. It extends into Spokane as well, as I'm sure you folks are probably already aware. You've all seen the ads, I'm sure, about the recent city council races and about who was being funded by what unions and so forth, particularly Snyder and Munn. And so, as I was looking at these ads, I decided, okay, well, let's figure out exactly how much money were these candidates getting from unions. And so one of the things that we did with our other research is we didn't just look at direct contributions from unions to the candidates. We also traced in money that was filtered through other political action committees or filtered even through party funds. Because the Democratic Central Committee at the state level gets about a third of their money, ultimately from labor unions. So once we crunched all the numbers on these city council races, we came to the conclusion that, again, about a third, over 30% of the funds for these two candidates came from labor unions. And those funds were enough to give them a fundraising edge over their opponents. And as you both know, or as you folks already know, both of those candidates were able to beat their more conservative opponents. And so this is an issue on the west side, this is an issue on the east side, that's something that affects the entire state. And again, I'd just like to drive this point home. The problem isn't that unions are participating in the electoral process, and that's absolutely fine. And the problem is that union members, individual union members, all too frequently do not have the choice about how the union spends those funds that they are forced to provide as a condition of their employment. That is the unjust foundation upon which this machine, this particular special interest, is based. And it's very influential, and that's why it's at the top of our priority list to address these labor issues and to increase freedom for individual workers and unions and try to give them a choice about whether or not to join a union or to pay the political related fees and so forth. And so that's going to be the main issue that I'll be working on in the coming months and years at the Freedom Foundation. So with all that said, we can talk about this a little more later if you're interested in the Q&A. But for now, I'd like to invite Dave back up, and he will continue our presentation. Since he got to kind of brag about me for a minute, I'd like the chance to brag about him. Dave has undergraduate degrees in political science and biblical studies, and he also has his law degree and a master's in theology. He spent 3 years in D.C. as an attorney for the Institute for Justice, and he co-founded the Freedom Center of Missouri, which is a nonprofit organization that litigates for individual liberty and limited government. His cases and research have been discussed in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Huffington Post, SCOTUSblog.com, on Fox News and MSNBC, and other major media outlets. And he is licensed to practice law in several state and federal jurisdictions, and is a member of the Bar of the U.S. Supreme Court. So please give a very warm welcome to Dave Roland.
Thanks, Max, and thanks again to everybody. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about, I pointed out a little bit earlier that this is part of our Free Washington tour, and we are traveling. This is our seventh stop out of 11 that we're on. We started a couple of days ago in Ellensburg, and from there we went to Yakima, Goldendale, Kennewick, Walla Walla, Pullman this morning, and now we're here in Spokane. Tonight we'll be driving on to Colville, and then we'll go to Republic, Omak, and Wenatchee. Colville. You can tell that I'm not frequently on this part of the state. So why do we do this? We came to the conclusion a couple of years ago that if we're going to make an impact for liberty in the state, one of the best things we can do is to connect with people on a local level. And we knew it would be important to get out and visit the communities, not just the larger cities like Spokane, but even the smaller communities, to spread the message of individual liberty, to help them understand what's going on at the state level and in Olympia, but also to equip them with the resources that they need to make a difference at home. Because if any one of us picked up the phone and tried to call the governor's office and tried to persuade him about a particular policy, we would just be one of several million in this state. And how much weight do you think he would give our phone call? But if one of us picks up the phone and calls our city council member, we're one of only a couple of thousand. Our voice carries much more weight at a local level than it does at a state level, and certainly more than it does at a national level. And so we thought, if we can equip you folks, the everyday activists who are out there in their communities, then you would be much better prepared to be effective advocates for liberty in your own communities. And we think that that will trickle up. As more and more people in communities at a local level understand free market principles, understand the ideals of individual liberty, they'll share with each other, and they'll start electing people to higher and higher office who share those values. That's why we think it's so important to connect on a local level. So, like I mentioned, we have 4 primary capacities. We research, we report, we educate, and we litigate. So tonight, you've seen a little bit about the research and reporting and educating. You've seen the Undue Influence publication that we put together. And if you look, we also have the Freedom in 39 Counties publications. You actually have 2 copies, 2 different versions of this. One deals with property rights, and the other one deals with taxes and spending. And what we're hoping to do is we want to make about 6 versions of this Freedom in 39 Counties report. And for each one, we'll deal with the aspect, say, property rights. And if you open up your publication, we have an easy-to-understand map of the state. And it shows the relative quality of the laws in each of the counties. So the best counties are going to be the ones that have the light gold color. They'll have a grade of A. The slightly darker gold color will have a B. And then the worst counties, predictably, will be dark blue, and they'll tend to hang out around the sound. But what this allows you to do is it allows you to see in each of these different issue areas what your local ordinances could look like, what your local laws could look like, and we have a recommendation. We say, these are the sorts of changes that a county could make that would make its climate better for individual liberty, better for free market principles. So when you understand these ideas and these recommendations, which we've tried to make very accessible, you're then better equipped to share with a neighbor or someone at your church or synagogue or one of your elected officials. And hopefully we've made this simple enough that they'll be able to understand it too, and they'll be able to appreciate the importance of working towards policies like those that we share in these publications. So again, that's part of our research and our reporting and our education function. We also, of course, deal with litigation. And one of the reasons that I love being our litigator is primarily because it helps us tell stories. When you get into a lawsuit, you dramatize a policy issue. You are able to take a real-life person who is suffering an injustice or a violation of their constitutional rights, and you can tell their story. For example, one of the cases that we've taken on, and it's you may have heard about this case. We finally got a ruling from the Washington Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago. But Washington State has some fantastic public disclosure laws, public records laws. About 4 decades ago, the people of Washington were very unsettled with how much was happening behind closed doors in their government at all levels. And so they passed laws that started with a preamble, with a simple statement of purpose. And it said, the people of this state do not surrender their sovereignty to the government that rules over them. That people demand the right to hold their elected officials accountable by reviewing the documents that those officials are producing, by having access to the meetings that those officials are engaged in. And those are the principles that animated our State Public Records Act and our State Open Public Meetings Act. And they're very powerful, and the courts, by and large, have done a really good job of ensuring that citizens have to have a right to access this information, because that's part of the way that we hold our government accountable. Well, there was at least one person who didn't like these ideas, and that was former Governor Christine Gregoire. Governor Gregoire was engaged in all sorts of behind closed doors conversations having to do with various things like medical marijuana, like the Seattle Supersonics, like transportation projects, like negotiations with the native tribes, all of which are very important political issues. All of which are things that really the people have every right to know, who is she talking to about this and what are they saying? What are the people that she's talking to saying? What is she saying? You know, there are records that would enlighten us as to the content of those conversations. But Christine Gregoire said, I'm above the law. She actually used exactly the same arguments that President Richard Nixon used when he didn't want to reveal his role in the Watergate scandal. Now, unfortunately, the United States Supreme Court looked at President Nixon and they said, this is the leader of the free world. This is someone engaged in international diplomacy. This is someone whose finger is on the nuclear button. He needs to have the best, most candid advice possible. And in order to ensure that a president is going to have that kind of advice, we need to give the president an executive privilege. So, well, after the U.S. Supreme Court said that, a handful of state courts said, well, our governor is kind of like the president, so they get executive privilege too. Well, Washington had never done that. Washington had never given the governor executive privilege. And so the question came up when Christine Gregoire said, I'm above the law, you can't make me. We sued and we said, yes, we can. And one of the things that we pointed out is that the Washington Constitution doesn't say anything about the governor getting an executive privilege. And that's particularly important because for years, Washington courts had said the governor's office does not have any powers the people have not given it. And we took these arguments into the court, and unfortunately, 8 of the justices disagreed. 8 of the justices said, just by creating an office of governor, that the people gave up any power that they had to require the governor to produce public records. Well, this is an unconscionable, a terrible decision. By the way, there is one justice on the Supreme Court who stood up for the people's control over government and not the government's control over people. And that's Justice James Johnson. Not coincidentally, you may recall that Washingtonians had also voted several times overwhelmingly to restrict the power of the legislature when it came to raising taxes. They said the legislature has to get 2/3 support in both houses of the body before they can raise taxes without the people's approval. Well, the Washington Supreme Court threw that out too. One justice stood up for the power of the people over government, not the power of government over people. And that was James Johnson. I hope people remember that. The thing is about public interest litigation of the sort that we do is that when the Washington Supreme Court or any other court rules against us, that's not the end of the story. The power of public interest litigation of the sort that we do is that we can capitalize on the outrage that follows from a bad decision like the one we got in the executive privilege case. When we took that case to the Washington Supreme Court, we actually got a lot of support from groups that you might be surprised about. The ACLU was on our side. Liberal newspapers all over the state were on our side because they understand the danger of government closing its doors to the people. And so here we had these unusual coalitions forming in support of the idea that we were expressing. And after we lost the Supreme Court case, those friends stood back up for us. And they've continued to say, the court got it wrong and we need to fix it. And so what's happened now is we've received calls from a Republican senator and a Democrat in the House of Representatives, and they've said, we want to get this fixed. Tell us how to do it. And so the Freedom Foundation gets to spearhead the pushback against this awful Washington Supreme Court decision. And even better, from my perspective, we get to do it in a completely nonpartisan manner. We get to come to them and say, this is not about partisan politics. It's not about parties. This is about what's right for the people. And that's true. That's true. But part of the reason why that's so important is that it's really easy for those of us who believe in individual liberty and limited government to talk to each other. It's very easy for us to get together in a room and all nod our heads together about issues. Our real challenge, if we're going to make a difference in this state, we've got to start impacting people who don't already agree with us on everything. And when we can come forward in a really nonpartisan manner and link arms with groups like the ACLU, like some of these liberal newspapers, that gets people's attention. That brings us to the awareness of folks who might not think that they agree with us on a whole lot, but then they find out they agree with us on this issue. And then they pay more attention. And then they find out, you know what, I think I might agree with them on this other issue as well. And that's the process of winning people over. That's the process of growing the liberty movement. And that's why I'm so excited about being part of the Freedom Foundation. One of the other things that we've done, if you've got the pins that we gave out, please take those home. We brought those so you could take them home. They've got our website on there. And if you go to our website, you'll see we've started a series of videos called the Tales of Tyranny videos. And again, the idea behind it is to tell stories, because we know that telling stories is a great way to touch people who aren't already in our circle. One of the stories that we've told has to do with a gentleman who owns a boat that's parked over in Seattle's harbor, and he sells organic produce off of this boat. Doesn't that sound like just the quintessential Seattle thing? Someone selling organic produce from a boat. Well, what happened is one of the people that he does business with got in trouble with the city. He racked up a bunch of parking tickets and had a whole bunch of fines. Well, the city was having a hard time putting its thumb on the guy who got in trouble. And so what they decided to do was go for the easy target. They said, here we've got this guy sitting right here. We know where he is. We know what business he conducts. Let's just go after him. Now this was not somebody who had gotten in trouble himself. The dealings that he had with this other person were very minimal. He didn't have any real responsibility for what this other person had done wrong, but the city was holding him accountable because he was an easy target. So he came to us, and we helped to tell his story. We put up a video that told about the injustice that was being done to him, and within 2 weeks, the city had reversed course. Within 2 weeks, the judgment against him had been reversed. And now he's free and clear. He's not having to worry about the continued viability of his business anymore, in thanks to the work that we did to help publicize his predicament. I do like to add that we have some wonderful young people helping us out, one of whom is an intern from Evergreen State College, if you can believe it. Connor was a bulldog on this story, advocating on behalf of the farm boat. And the city had actually enlisted the help of a collection agency to go after. Has anyone, don't raise your hands, but has anyone ever had to deal with a collection agency? They can be tenacious. They can be just, very persistent when it comes to going after somebody. Well, Connor turned the tables on them. Connor was so persistent in trying to get them to disclose the communications that they had received and sent between the city of Seattle and the agency, that they actually sent him a cease and desist letter that said, leave us alone, quit trying to we now have it stuck up on our bulletin board upstairs. We have the part highlighted when it says, you're harassing us. We just think it's hilarious. But we're thrilled because telling that story helps to highlight for a group of people, especially people who live in Seattle, they'll have an interest in what's going on in their town. For a group of people who might always think, oh, the government's wonderful, the government's here to help us. And we can show there's another side to this story that you really need to consider. Another story that I like to talk about. There's a gentleman up in Blaine on the Canadian border named Joe Reminar, and he is a free market environmentalist. Now, some of you may know about free market environmentalism, but these are people who believe in trying to improve the quality of the environment. They know that going through the government is not the way to do it. If you want to get something done, going through the government is the worst way to get it done. So he had this idea. He bought some property that didn't have any wetlands on it, and he thought to himself, I want to create a wildlife habitat. I want to create a wetland. Now, how many people in here own property and know that the last thing most people want is a wetland on their property? This guy wanted a wetland. So he created it. He built a beautiful little pond. Cranes started coming to his pond. Frogs started gathering at his pond. The Department of Fish and Wildlife came out and they said, you've done a good job. This is a beautiful little improvement that you've made to your local environment. You know who wasn't happy about this? The county. The county. And why was the county upset with this guy who had created this wetland on his property? Because he didn't ask for permission. He didn't ask for permission. And so when we tell Joe Reminar's story, what an environmentalist is confronted with is as much as they like to think that the government is in favor of the environment, the government wants to help the environment, in reality, what the government's interested in is control. Control. And the minute someone who favors the environment does something that outside of the government's control, the government will turn on them. That's a very important message to send. It's a very important thing for people to think about. Telling stories like this may not convert someone overnight. They may not have, a road to Damascus epiphany with a light shining down on them. Oh, all of a sudden I believe in free markets and individual liberty. But what it does is it plants seeds. It plants a kernel in their mind that as they continue to deal with the Freedom Foundation, as they continue to deal with you, it'll germinate and it'll start to grow. And I believe that if we are careful stewards of those thoughts, they'll blossom into people who believe with us in the ideals of individual liberty and limited government. So those are some of the reasons why I'm really excited about the work that we're doing at the Freedom Foundation. I came up to the Freedom Foundation about a year ago, and I came from Missouri, which is a pretty solidly red state. Just to put it in some perspective, they've got veto-proof majorities in both houses of the legislature down there. And when I told my friends and supporters down there that I was going to be coming to Washington, they said, you're going to that nest of liberal vipers. Why in the world would you do this? And I said, because I see a mission field. I see an opportunity to make a real difference for the cause of individual liberty. And that's what we're doing at the Freedom Foundation. And it's not just 18 people in an office in Olympia, which is what we are. But it's also our statewide team of individual supporters. Over 20 years since we were founded by Bob Williams. Some of you, I'm sure, know Bob personally. But in the 20 years since Bob started the Freedom Foundation and designed it to be a firewall between the government and the people's liberties, we've built this incredible network of support. Thousands of Washingtonians all over the state are part of our team. And it's not just about financial support either. Some of the most important things you can do involve taking the risk of talking to a neighbor, taking the risk of running for office, taking the risk of standing up and saying, you know what? Government's not always the answer. In fact, more frequently, government's the problem. When you take those risks, you're advancing our mission. However, part of supporting the Freedom Foundation is financial. And one of the things that we looked at a couple of months ago was the fact that some of our supporters would write one big check, and some of our supporters would kind of sporadically send checks in. And we thought one of the things that would really be helpful to us is having a little bit more predictability about when revenues were coming in. If anyone runs a business or if you're trying to manage a household budget, you know that predictability in revenue is really helpful when it comes to making future plans. And so that was one of the things that we thought we would focus on. And so we started the Patriots Club. And the idea behind the Patriots Club is to ask people who support our mission to say, once a month, we're going to make a contribution. And we generally say that kind of as the default, $25 a month is where we'd like for those contributions to be. But we also recognize that not everybody has the means to do that. And so we don't want anyone to feel like they're bound to $25. But by committing to provide a steady, consistent level of support, that allows us to plan accordingly how we're going to go about accomplishing our mission. So you've got the Connect cards with you, and you've got your information on them, I hope. If you've got the means, I hope that what you'll do is check the yes box and let us know that you're interested in helping to provide us with a consistent, predictable level of support so that we can continue telling our stories, going out and doing the work that we're doing in local communities and also in the state legislature and sometimes even in Washington, D.C., to try and spread the news about individual liberty and limited government, and also to help people in your own community start to take those ideas and put them to practice in their local government. While you are finishing up filling out your Connect cards, I'm going to just kind of give you an idea about the work that we're doing with the CTAC proposition, or what we're planning with the CTAC proposition, because I think you'll find it interesting. And if you as you fill those out, if you would pass them to the middle, and I believe either Max or Mark or both will be able to help take those up. But one of the things that that Max pointed out with the CTAC proposition is it really is about providing special favors for a group of businesses that the government likes, as opposed to a group of businesses that the government doesn't like so much. Well, you know, the Washington Constitution has something to say about that. And so I can pull out my handy copy of the Washington Constitution, and if I turn to Article 1, Section 12, it says, "No law shall be passed granting to any citizen, class of citizens, or corporation privileges or immunities which upon the same terms shall not equally belong to all citizens or corporations." Well, that means, pure and simple, you're not supposed to give special treatment to a business. Pure and simple. And as Max pointed out, that's really what Proposition 1 is about. It's not about a $15 minimum wage. It's not about the different benefits that are laid out. It's about giving a competitive advantage to union shops against non-union shops. That's what it's about. And so if Proposition 1 ends up passing, one of the things that we're looking at doing is filing a constitutional lawsuit and saying, you know what, the Washington Constitution has something to say about this. And what it says is that this law cannot stand. We're also interested in making a different argument that would be filed alongside the Washington constitutional argument, and that has to do with the freedom of association. The courts have been really good about recognizing that we have a freedom to choose who we're going to associate with. That's why all of us can get together in this room, and the Spokane city government and the Washington state government and the U.S. federal government can't do anything about it. We have a right to associate with each other. But there's a flip side to that as well, and that's that they can't force us to associate with people that we don't want to. So if there is a group, like let's just say a really hateful group like the Ku Klux Klan, and we don't want to associate with them, the government can't pass a law that says you have to associate with these people. All right? Now here's the question. Can the government say, we're going to hand out some special government benefit, but it's only available to people who will associate with the Ku Klux Klan? It's only available to people who are willing to go give up their constitutional right not to associate with those people. But you have to waive that right if you're going to get this government benefit. Well, no, you can't do that. That's what we call an unconstitutional condition. And we think that when you've got a city, CTAC, holding out this special benefit, this competitive business advantage, And it says, you only get this competitive advantage if you're willing to enter into an agreement with these people that you may not want anything to do with. That's an unconstitutional condition. And so we think that if we get these arguments in front of the courts, we think that there's a reasonable chance that the courts would rule in our favor. But like I said, with public interest litigation, even if our legal claims were not ultimately successful, we would still be exposing the law for what it really is. We'd still be showing, you know, those unions that were working so hard saying, oh, everybody needs to have a $15 minimum wage, everyone ought to have these different benefits, that's why we need to pass this law? The whole reason they were passing this law is so that they could then waive those very rights that they said they were so interested in. If it gave them a leg up, you know, and helped them to attract members, that's what they were interested in the law. But really, they rigged the law so that they could not pay a $15 minimum wage if they wanted to. They could waive the sick leave requirement if they wanted to. And that's hypocrisy, out and out hypocrisy. And by telling a story like that, we think that it would taint any future efforts to pass one of these so-called living wage ordinances. So that's some of the work that we're looking at in terms of public interest litigation. If we could, let's go ahead and let's pull those cards up to the front. We're gonna do the drawing, but at this time we'd also like to pull Max up here and we'll take questions from the crowd. So if you've got questions either about the presentation tonight or about what the Freedom Foundation is doing more generally, please go ahead and raise your hands and we'll start answering them. Yes, sir.
Yeah, in this special legislative session, what was the result of those who raised the question about special benefits ought to be made available to all businesses?
Well, I mean, there's not the political support to do that, but thankfully at least the argument was made. My understanding was that the tax benefits that were passed specifically for Boeing were made contingent upon Boeing choosing to make this 77X Dreamliner in Washington. And so they'll only get those benefits if they end up staying in Washington. I think I'm going to have to let Dave answer the rest of the questions.
I'll just add in, you know, this is one of the things is the way a lot of politicians think is that they don't feel the need to be consistent. You know, they don't suffer any intellectual trauma, although they should, when they make a statement like, oh, well, you know, clearly taxes and regulations are too high, you know, and then they turn around and say, well, but they're only too high for the biggest, wealthiest company in the state. You know, they don't suffer that cognitive dissonance the way that they should. So part of our job is to highlight for the voters the inconsistency. Because if the politician themselves isn't going to realize that inconsistency and adjust accordingly, then it's our job to help the voters understand the problem with that person so that hopefully they will be wise enough to replace them with someone who will be more consistent in the way that they think about these things.
Was there one or some legislators on that, taking that position on behalf of all of the states?
Taking the position that only Boeing should get the special?
No, that it should be spread.
My understanding is that Representative Manweller is the one who made the clearest statement, but I don't believe he was the only one. I think that there were several members of the legislature who were willing to stand up and say, hey, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Boeing shouldn't get special treatment. But Representative Manweller is the only one that I can think of off the top of my head. When we send around our email kind of recapping the special session, I believe we probably have that information available in there. So let's go ahead and do a drawing for one of these items. I'd like to start off with a drawing for the Washington State Constitution. So that's what this drawing is going to be for. Madam Committee Woman, if you could draw one of these cards.
Not your own.
You'd be amazed at how frequently that happens. We have David Werdinger. All right, congratulations. You get a copy of the Washington State Constitution. And again, if anyone else would like a copy, we will have them available for sale for $5 each afterward. So let's go ahead and let's take another question. We'll save the Enlightened Democracy book for the end. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm just wondering, is there any precedence that's been set that you can point to where you think that your argument will be successful in the Supreme Court? Because knowing the political bent of the Supreme Court, I can't imagine them ruling anything that would be anti-union unless there's some pretty hardened precedent that they would have to point to.
Well, what we would aim for is federal court. So when you're thinking about constitutional issues, generally speaking, you've got two choices. You can file in state court, or you can file in federal court. Usually when you're dealing with state-specific claims, state courts will tend to have a better understanding of those issues and more interest usually in making sure that they're being judged properly. But when it comes to many constitutional issues, in fact, the opposite is the case. You get a lot of judges at the local level who are more interested in pleasing the local elected officials than they are in upholding the Constitution, which is how we get the result that we got in both of the major constitutional cases I mentioned, the 2/3 majority for tax increases case and the executive privilege case. But as far as the way that federal courts have dealt with freedom of association, I actually think that we've got a pretty good argument to make. It's unusual. I'm not aware of anyone who's tried an argument quite like that. But there's been a solid set of precedents dealing with the freedom of association. You may recall that the Boy Scouts have had a couple of cases that called into question, can they be penalized for putting a limit on the types of persons with whom they'll associate. And the courts have generally been pretty good saying, yes, people get to choose who they associate with. There's a logical connection to unions. However, there have been cases that have said that when someone is working within an industry where the union is going to be providing collective bargaining, because that person is by definition going to be benefiting from the union's activities, they can be forced to pay in a certain amount to the union. They can't be forced to join the union. I actually think that the cases that say that someone can be forced to pay into a union are not applicable, because we're not talking about a situation where a worker is in an industry that is already unionized. We're talking about whether businesses can be forced to negotiate a contract with the union. Does that make sense, the distinction there? Okay. So I think that the analysis would be, can you force a business owner, who is a private individual, to enter into a contract with someone that they otherwise would not deal with, so that they can get this government benefit? Like I said, to the best of my knowledge, it's a fairly novel argument. So I don't know how to predict the likelihood of success, but I do know it's an important fight to make. So that's something that we're definitely taking seriously, and I think that win or lose, the victory is in getting the arguments out there and forcing people to confront those issues at an intellectual level. So. Yes, sir.
Well, kind of a two-part question. Does the Freedom Foundation, when the legislature's in session, do they have somebody present to listen and throughout the session to hear what's going on?
Well, kind of. It depends on what you're saying. The legislature is actually televised. Like a lot of their sessions and committee hearings are accessible via the internet. However, we do have people who will go down to the Capitol for select events, not for all of them. Jeff Rhodes writes the Olympia Report, which is one of our reporting mechanisms. It's an online newspaper, and so he is frequently down at the Capitol, attending hearings, attending press conferences. Sometimes he even asks questions at press conferences. So we have that sort of a presence. We also will occasionally go and testify on bills. Not usually to say vote for this, don't vote for this, but to talk about the policy implications of the various choices. And so we do have a pretty active presence at the Capitol. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're aiming at.
Yeah, that's the first part.
Okay.
So my question comes from this way beyond me, and I know there's people in here that understand these things better than I do. So anybody wants to jump in and straighten me out, I'm all over. Okay, so I was listening to a video this morning on Facebook from Joel Krebs, and he was addressing, as the House Minority Leader, he was addressing them and saying that in regard to the Boeing vote, that you know, the 7th District had nothing to gain from that, so he should be voting no, but he was going to vote yes because he felt that it was providing employment opportunity. That was, and that may not be exactly the phrase, but I know it was employment and it was opportunity. And I'm, you know, 25 years as general contractor and an owner's representative in construction. I do anything I can to put glue underneath the feet of union people, because they've always been a nemesis in my life. But anyway, so I immediately read that is, what opportunity is that for regular people? So my question is, how does that work out?
I think that's a very good question.
How do the machinations of that work out to be right?
Well, I can't speak to the decision that he made because I don't know him. I don't know how he goes about making decisions. But one thing I can say from having observed politicians over many years now is that politicians, by and large, like to make easy decisions. And it may be that either due to word that he was getting from people within his district, or possibly from people who have been very friendly to his campaigns in the past, or possibly other people within the state party may have said, hey, you might want to think voting this way. I don't know what led him to do that. But from my experience, any one of those factors could lead a politician to make a decision like that. You know, even if they don't really have a personal stake, or their district doesn't seem to have a personal stake in it, they may have some deal with somebody that says it might be smarter for me, it might be the easier decision for me just to go ahead and go with the flow on this. So that's the best answer I can give you. I don't know that any of our folks have kind of a window into how that decision was made.
Proper strategy.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Ruth? When you were talking about open government, I'm going to assume that most everybody here knows that our Lori Rogers got the Key Award from.
That's right.
So, that's because she was.
That was just announced a couple of days ago, right?
Yeah. Right. And she, you know, being very persistent in doing requesting, and that's why I thought Tim and I ought to have been there at her little ceremony or something. Did you get to go?
Yes.
You did, good. I didn't get to go. It was one of the meetings I dropped something off. You know, some of us folks do a lot of public records requesting, and you pass each other in the hallway sometimes. You know?
Yeah, public records requests are a vital tool for being able to keep track of what your government's doing. Not only for exposing corruption, although that's sometimes a very valuable thing that you can do with public records requests, but also just to make sure that you understand how your elected officials are thinking. In fact, someone could do a public records request for you know, well, for any number of things, but basically that would enlighten the voters as to how elected officials go about making their decisions. And if you don't like what you find, if you're not you know, favorably inclined to who these folks are talking to or what they're saying, that gives you a reason to say, let's try and get somebody else in office. So open records are incredibly important. Yes, sir.
I just want to thank you for those open records. I actually have personally done records requests. Now they know who I am. I have to wait 3 years for the next one. But in the ones that I've received, I actually had department heads naming me, asking their subservient employees how to get rid of people like me, how to keep those records out of our hands, that kind of thing. Yeah. So it's really the work you do.
Well, so does anyone remember, who was it a few months back that broke the story about the IRS and kind of their selective treatment of conservative and Tea Party groups? That inspired one of our guys, Glenn Morgan, to file public records requests asking basically for any government record that used the words Tea Party, Teabagger, Ron Paul, But all of these terms, just because we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to know what government agencies are saying about these groups? And so we got, is it millions? It's tens of thousands at a bare minimum, and possibly millions of records. And there is a strategy that government officials sometimes use, trying to bury the stuff that they're worried about. And we suspect that may have taken place. But we're actually going through, filtering through all of that, and trying to find out exactly what they're saying about things like that. But that's one of the things you can do with public records requests. Similarly, we're helping out a group over in Olympia right now. This is a really cool story I hope to tell more about in the coming months. But a young Native American man had a calling to try and serve the homeless. He's a Christian, and he took it upon himself as a ministry to try and serve the homeless by providing food and fellowship to them in downtown Olympia. He calls this group Crazy Faith Ministries. And they gather once a week, and they had been doing this for 3 years. Never had a complaint, never had a broken law or a citation for anything. And in fact, gathering at the location that they do in downtown Olympia is perfectly legal. If all of us wanted to run over across the state and meet in this location in Olympia, we'd be allowed to do it. Perfectly legal. But because a couple of people complained, because they're not so fond of homeless people, the city started trying to pressure Crazy Faith out of the city. And for the last couple of months now, we understand, although we don't have direct evidence yet, that there have been conversations going on at the Olympia City Hall about how do we get rid of these people. And so a couple of weeks ago, I submitted a public records request, and I said, all right, I want any record you've got referencing Ben Charles, referencing Crazy Faith Ministries, or talking about homeless people gathering in downtown Olympia. I want to know what's being said. They told me that we'll get some records in the middle of December. So I'm eagerly anticipating getting those back. They don't know my name yet. Yeah. They don't know my name yet, which is why we're getting them this year. Maybe next time around I'll get the 3 years from now response. But public records are a very powerful tool for Washingtonians keeping their government in check, and that's why we're really looking forward to working with the legislature and hopefully giving the people a vote on a constitutional amendment that would make clear that we've got to have access to those records. Yes, ma'am.
With reference to the Jan Angel race, I really appreciate that you're giving us the details with reference to the contributions made by the unions. I would ask the next question with reference to the outside of Washington State funding that came in, especially from a large donor from California, with the attempt to defeat Jan Angel's race. Is Freedom Foundation getting involved in that level of who's giving money to whom?
Last week, Glenn Morgan published a blog post, or it may have been Monday. No, it was last week. It was the end of last week, pointing out the amount of money that, I can't remember the name of the hedge fund billionaire in California who had donated to Schlichter's campaign. So yes, that analysis is taking place. I personally think that it is a slightly different situation because it's much less likely that someone from outside of the state has like a personal interest. It's possible that they may have a personal interest, but I'm not aware of what personal advantage that donor might gain from making his contributions. So contrast that with a union located in Washington State where if this person gets elected, then that vote could directly influence the further functioning of the union in Washington State. So it may be that out-of-state donor has a personal influence or has a personal stake in the election. It may not be. I just don't know. But we've definitely commented on it and made clear that it's a question people should be asking. And that's the other thing is I think it's very important not always to assume when we don't have all the facts. So for example, I'm careful about attributing motives to that donor because I just don't know. It may be the question should be asked. That's what Washingtonians should be thinking about when they're deciding how they're going to vote. So. Yes, sir.
I actually researched that data, out-of-state contributions, because when I ran for office, I wanted to know where people were getting donations for their campaigns. And because we are a port state, there's a lot of out-of-state donations to both parties.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. Yes, ma'am.
Back on Lori Rogers, excuse me. I have something in common here. She also has a public disclosure request in, that she filed in 11, that she's still waiting. She does not have an attorney on it yet, but it's for the election cycle that the school district here in Spokane put out election campaign information and distributed it in their school publication and sent it home. And that's what she has also in the works. And so we'll be hearing more. Also
Right. Yeah. That situation is not thoroughly resolved because now that Ms. Rogers has won kind of this stage, they've got to go back and try and resolve some of the other issues that have followed along from it. So yeah, there may well be more information coming out. I expect that there will be more information coming out. But yeah, we absolutely need patriots who are willing to step up, and it was not an easy fight for her. I mean, that was a long fight, and she was taking a lot of heat. And one of the things that is so important is that we have people with the personal courage to stand up and take that heat because they have the courage of their convictions.
And she does, and she
yeah.
also had a couple of attorneys.
That's right. Yeah, Michelle Earl Hubbard
Yes,
is representing her, isn't she? Yeah, and Michelle Earl Hubbard is with me on the board of the Washington Coalition for Open Government, and she is a tremendous attorney. She actually argued our executive privilege case at the Washington Supreme Court. It was before I came on board. But she is a tremendous attorney and a wonderful ally for a lot of the causes that the Freedom Foundation pursues. So yeah, we were glad that she was involved in that case, and we know she's going to continue to do a great job representing Ms. Rogers' interests. Yes, sir.
Is there any consideration of challenging navigators involved in the healthcare in the state of Washington, particularly with their previous relationships with ACORN and such organizations?
It's not immediately apparent to me what kind of a claim we would be able to bring. One of the things that I sometimes have to tell people is just because something's infuriating and just because something's raises question marks doesn't necessarily mean that gives us a good hook to go and sue somebody about. And so I think it's perfectly legitimate to be concerned about the people who are acting as navigators, but I can't immediately think of a good legal theory for how that would be challenged. So no, I wouldn't say that there are plans to do anything like that. Let's go ahead and let's get our other drawing made, and that way anyone who has to go on and continue with their evening tonight will have the opportunity to do so. But also I want to make clear that Max and I are happy to stay. Well, I'm happy to answer questions. Max,
Sign language.
yeah, Max will be playing charades to act out his answers. But we're happy to stick around for a while and answer additional questions if people have them. Did I see that you were also an elected official?
I'm a state committee woman for.
State committee, that works for me. Would you mind drawing the next card? Right there. And we've got David Wallace. All right. You get your copy of Enlightened Democracy, the Case for the Electoral College.
Thank you.
So I hope you enjoy it. Okay, again, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to the church for hosting us. Like I said, we're happy to stick around for a while and act out answers to questions. But anyone who needs to go ahead and continue on with their evening, feel free to go ahead and do that. Thank you very much for coming. And we've also got copies of the Constitution for sale if anyone wants it.